It is with much joy and admiration that I ask you to join me in this celebration of historical honesty, this welcoming of conscience, this witness to integrity, to join me in percussive appreciation of this literary critic, linguist, anthropologist. There are those among us that have asked that we join together to keep hope alive. Tonight I ask that you join me with Dr. Sertima in resurrecting the truth. Dr. Van Sertima.
I would like to begin my lecture tonight by paying tribute to two of my elders, one alive and one dead, who by their speeches and their writings have done more than anyone in our generation to make us very much aware of the Africanness of the Egyptian heritage and of its relationship to us. And one of these men is in the audience today, Dr. Joseph Ben Jochannan. Would Dr. Ben please stand? The other is Sheikh Anta Diop. And it is with Diop that I shall begin, because Diop appeared, one of the few who was invited by UNESCO to help in rewriting the history of Africa. There was a conference in 1974 in Cairo on the peopling of Africa, and for the very first time, an international body invited Africans to say something about African history. Sheikh Anta Diop of Senegal and Théophile Obenga of the Congo. Diop presented a great number of arguments establishing the Africanness of the Egyptian civilization, but the most important contribution he made, and very significant contribution, was the linguistic contribution. Diop established clearly and beyond the shadow of a doubt, by showing thousands of intimate interconnections, familial interconnections between the languages of Africa and the Egyptian language, that it was structurally, fundamentally an African language, that it was not Afro-Semitic or Afro-Hamitic or Afro-Asiatic or Afro-anything, it was African. And one of the things that stands out in our memory is what UNESCO had to say at the end of that conference in their report, that although they had made it quite clear to all the delegates that they should come well prepared, well researched, because this was to be a turning point. Many things were to be decided after 2 centuries of debate. Only 2 gentlemen turned up, they said, with well-researched papers. And who were those gentlemen? The Africans, Théophile Obenga and Sheikh Anta Diop. There were at that conference many brilliant Europeans, some of them Africanists, not just Eurocentric Europeans, many of them in Diop's corner. But everybody came expecting to repeat themselves, because they thought that in spite of all the controversy, this was a decided and settled matter. I don't think ever again they will come unprepared when men like Diop Obenga, and others whom you shall hear this weekend, I don't think that when these men appear, other people will come unprepared again, because we have been taken too long for granted. And for the first time, for the first real time, we are not alone. We have built a school of thinking, and we have built scholars who are becoming more and more informed and responsible. No longer the idle, hollow boasts of the past. Now everything we say, or most of what we say, most of us can establish this on hard, solid ground. And what we come here tonight to do, my intention here tonight, is not to seek to undermine the achievements and accomplishments of other peoples, but to show in very real sense, not only were we the creators of the Egyptian civilization, but that our equality in the world, the equality of the black peoples of the world, is not built on any biblical fantasy or any liberal sentiment. It is rooted in hard, concrete, historical realities. Diop was a particularly well-accomplished man. His first career was in physics. He had worked in the most advanced nuclear lab in Europe under Frederick Julio Curie. Diop gave up physics, or really he did not give it up, because he was to become director of the radiocarbon lab in Africa, the first radiocarbon lab in Africa. He didn't give it up, but he decided to use it, to use his scientific accomplishments in order to establish that Egypt was African. And when he presented his thesis, it was wrongly rejected. How absurd! How dare you say such a thing? The University of Paris rejected it. Do you know, the week after he died, the first people to write me from Europe to ask for a copy of the book that was in process, Great African Thinkers, the book I edited on Sheikh Anta Diop, who do you think wanted so desperately to get that book? And to honor him, and to buy his original manuscripts and to house them? The University of Paris, who had rejected him. Truly, as it is said in the Bible, the rejected one will become the cornerstone of the new foundation. Far more than the linguistic arguments were the other cultural elements. There was the peculiar form of totemism. The totems of the Africans south of Egypt were the totems of the Egyptians. The cultigens, the agricultural things that we find in the pre-dynastic and dynastic Egypt, comes out of the Sudanic agricultural complex. The bottle gourd, the Laganaria caesarearia. The gossypium, the special forms of cultivated cotton, Gossypium herbaceum. The oil palm fruit, the tamarind fruit, the watermelon, all of these things are African. If somebody else was coming in civilizing Egypt, where are their cultigens? And then people created a pyramid building race who came into Egypt and built pyramids. Then where are their pyramids? Where did they learn this extraordinary? You will hear something so astonishing about the pyramids. You will realize why it is that there has been so much dispute about Egypt. Because what the Egyptians did, few of us really know how remarkable it is. The Japanese found out recently. The Japanese went to Egypt to build a pyramid. The Japanese took all the conventional wisdom that we had about the Egyptians that had been passed on to us, how they had handmade tools. They were not in the high technology range that we are today, so they built the finest handmade tools to cut the stone that Egyptians cut. Couldn't cut it. They improved it, couldn't cut it. Then they took air jackhammers, high modern technology, to cut the stone. And then they came to the second stage. Now we've used high technology, modern technology to cut the stone, because nothing that we thought could cut stone like that couldn't cut the stone. Diop had made that quite clear, that when they found iron, smelted iron, near the pyramids, they said it had fallen through a crack in the earth. It didn't belong to the pyramid age. That iron smelting was to come much later from the Hittites, who passed it on to the Syrians. Even I believed that. All of us believed that until Diop showed scientifically it is not true. These people had gone into highly advanced iron smelting in the pyramid age. They could not cut those things with bronze tools. So they used air jackhammers. So then they come to the next problem. They saw all of these pictures, and every Egyptologist had said how these Egyptians would have a lot of labor, and they would move these big things and put it on the barges. The Japanese tried to put them on the barges capsized. So they had to use steamboats. Jumping straight back into high technology, they used steamboats. So then they got it down the steamboats, and they got down to the desert. Now you have to lift it and put it in the desert and erect it. When they took the stone off the steamboats, it sank in the mud. When they dragged it out of the mud, it sank in the sand. So they got cranes. The cranes broke. Then they got better cranes. And they lifted it up, and then comes the problem. Put it now in alignment like the great Egyptians. The Egyptians put those stones in such an alignment, they are 1/1000th of an inch accuracy. The only people on earth today who achieve that accuracy are opticians cutting glass. That is how they moved that stone. That is how they cut that stone. The Japanese started to use helicopters. So they used air jackhammers instead of the so-called primitive tools or handmade tools or bronze tools. And then they used steamboats instead of the barges. And then they used cranes instead of all of these big masses of human labor they thought the Egyptians were using. And then they used helicopters. And then they decided they had to let it go. They couldn't do it. And they were not using 50-ton blocks, which the Egyptians put at the top of their skyscrapers. They were using 2-ton blocks of stone, and they couldn't do it. So make no mistake, you are dealing with extraordinary people. Because the next myth coming up in the 21st century is how the Japanese are the superior people of the world. It's going to shift from the European to the Asiatic. So get it quite clear. In the very early stages of civilization, something very unusual happened. I was with my wife in Egypt last summer, and we went to Aswan. And I looked at a block, an obelisk, a stone obelisk which had been cut many centuries ago. And I looked at the way it had been cut, the perfection of the cut. I looked at the stone, and I wondered why they had abandoned this obelisk. They abandoned it, they said, because it had a flaw. And I looked carefully. It is true, my eyes are not what they used to be. I could not see this flaw, so I used my hands, which are extremely sensitive. And it had to be pointed out to me where the flaw was, and it was very clear to me it would have taken centuries for that flaw to really make a difference. But our people didn't play around with things. It had to be perfect. When the Japanese were building the pyramid, when they tried to put the stones in alignment, they cracked and broke and were badly scratched. When they went to check the stones that the Egyptians had put into alignment, 1/1000th of an inch accurate, not a single stone was scratched or cracked. You are dealing with people who felt you had to be as perfect as possible. Let us pray that those of us, our people who learn of their heritage, their ancestors, will not accept mediocrity as their standards. People ask us, why are we so angry about this thing? Why are we so worked up about it? What does it matter? It happened thousands of years ago. Why does it matter? And the question arises, why does it matter to them? Because at UNESCO, when Diop went further, and he went between the derm and the epiderm, and he established through the melanin dosage test that the level of melanin, the density of melanin in the skin of the mummies was so great that it could not be leucoderm but melanoderm types, no caucasoids. And then Abdullah the Egyptian delegate, Abdullah the Egyptian delegate jumped up and said, even if they're black skinned, they're whites. They're just darkened by the sun. It's very hot out there, by the way. Do you know why it is important? Because the Egyptian, the modern Egyptian, is not an Egyptian. When the Egyptian minister of culture jumps up in the newspapers, I've seen it in some Dallas newspaper, the Egyptian minister of culture talking about my culture, my foot. It has nothing to do with him. The Arabs came into Egypt in 638 AD, thousands of years after the Pyramid Age. They have nothing to do with it. It's like President Reagan or President Bush talking about Teotihuacan. There is no connection. They cannot talk about Native American civilization because most of us in this room, with possibly only one or two exceptions, are not native to place. We are the Europeans and the Africans and the later Asiatic who came here, some of us dragged here, long after the Native Americans. So how can we call this, not this now, but how can we call Teotihuacan my culture? When Sadat was here, and Sadat was quite unusual, his mother was Sudanic, and he wanted to make a point, and he did it melodramatically. He said it on CBS, and they struck it off the air, although he repeated it later to Jesse Jackson. He said, I am a black man, and I'm the first true pharaoh in 2,000 years. And what he was trying to say is that I am different, I am native. I can lay claim to that civilization. Naguib could have said that too. Very few of the Egyptians can say that. And this is not running down the Arab, as we shall see in the close of this lecture. The Arab, though he came in as a semi-primitive into Egypt, wild, roving, nomadic hordes, he was to draw upon the scientific heritage of Egypt too, and later on he was to make his own original and extraordinary contributions. We are not here to run down any people. We are just here to set the record straight. Because it seems that everybody has their heritage, but as soon as we try to claim ours, why are you making a fuss? We are making a fuss not because we are racists, I hope not. We are making a fuss because we have been scrupulously excluded from any major things in history. Wherever anything extraordinary is found in Africa, it cannot be African. Hamites brought it in. Asiatics brought it in. Caucasoids brought it in. We are the dumb, slow idiots of the world. And therefore, it is our duty to correct that impression. At the UNESCO conference in 1974, Jean Vercoutre, an excellent Frenchman, admirable fellow for whom I have a great respect in spite of his schizophrenia on this matter, he said, okay, the language is clearly African, that has been established, The writing is African. The culture is African. And as Saab Soderbergh has shown in the head of the Scandinavian expedition to Sudanese Nubia, the techno-complex is African. The problem is, we really don't know for sure how many of them were African. Could you imagine doing that in Europe? The language is French. It is clear from studying the history of the French that this is a French development and accomplishment. They're using the Roman script, which the Romans brought to the French, but we're not sure if they're Frenchmen. It's so absurd. But no, we could not be right when they tried cranial studies. Not everybody has a flat nose. Not everybody has pronounced prognathism, and I'm talking about pure, unmixed Africans. There isn't just one type of Negro, as they like to call them, but they decided there was the classical Negro. And so they worked out the cranial measurements for the classical Negro, and they said there were 36% Negroes. But there was a large body, almost 35% brown Mediterranean. Who are these brown Mediterraneans? Those people who do not fit very nicely into true Negroes, and yet are not Caucasoids because they allow 11% Cro-Magnon, which is Caucasoid, and the rest they didn't know about. And then Falkenberger did that, William McIver did that. Diop showed if I were to take those measurements and take them into the graveyards of Africa, everybody is a brown Mediterranean. And Chatterjee and Kumar, in a study in 1965, showed that crania found in Nubia, pre-dynastic Egypt, and crania studied in the Old Kingdom in Egypt, and crania studied in the 12th and 13th dynasty had the same features. In other words, if those people are brown Mediterraneans, then the Nubians are brown Mediterraneans. And the many Africans would be simply reclassified as brown Mediterraneans. Why was it so important? Nobody in Europe ever doubted that the Egyptians were Africans until the 19th century. The early 19th century, the Greeks clearly knew them as Africans. They saw them. They were not speculating. They walked among them. They fought with them. They conquered them. They lived with them. They studied under them. And they said they were black-skinned and woolly-haired. But after the slave trade, yes, perhaps they're dark, but the sun darkened the Caucasoid or the Asiatic, etc. True, there were mixtures, obviously. Civilizations draw all sorts of things into them, and the Egyptians did not remain homogeneous. And there's the odd Egyptian here and there whom we cannot classify with absolute certainty as an Africoid. There is some intermarriage in certain stages, but there is absolutely no question in the light of a vast body of evidence that in the Pyramid Age, which was to establish the foundation of the political and religious structures and the techno-complex, that we are dealing with a dominant Africoid figure. And this is also in the Middle Kingdom, and it is also in the highest point of Egypt, the 18th and 19th dynasties. The brilliant essay by Le Grand Clerc II shows us very clearly that that is so. And it is so in the Sudanese dynasties in the evening of Egypt. But what we did not know for certain, and which we have found now, is the missing link, Ta-Seti. In 1962, an American team on the Keith Seal discovered a pharaonic dynasty south of Egypt, which had all the major markings of the pharaonic dynasties. There they found the palace facades and the palace erects. There they found the falcon god Horus, the son of God. Among the Egyptians, the Christ, the first Christ figure. And there they found the crown of the south, unmistakable shape of the crown of the south, and the heads of a dozen black pharaohs, even before Aha or Narmer Menes or whoever, Scorpion or whoever was the first in Egypt. And there they found the beginnings of the hieroglyphs. In other words, there was now no question that the Nubian was not merely in the evening, he was in the dawn. And it took them 16 years before they announced this. They said it took them 16 years to put the pieces together. But there were some of those pieces, like a stone incense burner from Nubia, that didn't need putting together. It wasn't even broken. But the man in charge of that expedition, Keith Seal, sat on it until he died. And after he died, thank God for his passing at that stage, because were it not for that, we would not have even heard of it. There emerged from the back rooms of the museums things which had been pushed aside, and a whole new picture emerged. And then came people, this could not be true. Lost pharaohs of Nubia, Bruce Williams, it could not possibly be true. And there were attacks on Bruce Williams, and he replied brilliantly. If you read the papers, not only the lost pharaohs of Nubia, but the attack that was made and the brilliant defense point by point, you will know why this is so important. At UNESCO, Gamal Abdul Mokhtar, head of the project, when I asked him, I said, "Sir, I need Diop's paper, Origin of the Egyptians, to publish in the Journal of African Civilization." He said, "I will give you permission, Van Sertima, but you have to publish a disclaimer saying that we didn't all agree to it." This is the Egyptian, you know. Doesn't want to be called black. No, sir. Because the black figure had suffered a tremendous loss of status in the world. We had been turned slaves. So that when Count Volney, even in that late stage, walked among them, and they had already become mixed with many peoples, he said, "It is clear to me that this is a Negro race, and that we owe so much of our arts and sciences to these people we have made our slaves, the objects of our contempt." He was troubled by that guilt. And there were so many who went there with fixed ideas, like the man who wrote, Budge, who wrote the Egyptian dictionary, at first thinking they were Caucasoids or Afro-Asiatic, and when he started to write his dictionary, he began to realize all the roots of these things lie in Africa. And Gerald Massey saw that. And you look at the language, Kenti means south. And do you know what it also means? It means first. Those people south of them were first. And they created one of the names for Africa. Africa came through many names. Sometimes they were called Ethiopians and Libyans and all sorts of things. But there is a name that is in Egyptian, Afro-Ika. It was not for the continent, but it was for the people south of them. Afro-Ika meaning beginnings. And they call their people Kemiu, the dark people, the black people, Kemet, the black land. And they said the reason why it was calling it the black land is because the earth is black. I don't know what they're talking about. Everything had to be turned upside down to make it correct. The black does not fit here. I know that from so many other scientific studies here in America. When they went into the lab, they took the cotton, Gossypium hirsutum. There are two tetraploid cottons, the major cultivated cottons of America, Gossypium hirsutum and Gossypium barbadens. And when they checked it out in the lab, they found to their astonishment of 26 chromosomes, 13 belonged to an African cultivated diploid, Gossypium herbaceum, and the other 13 is a wild American ancestral cotton. And a marriage or fusion had occurred between a wild American ancestor and a cultivated African diploid 2,000 years before Jesus in America. Now, how could that be? So they said, perhaps it floated from Africa by itself. So that was tested scientifically. You had to test every theory scientifically. So they built a lab. A tank in the lab, Professor Stevens, and he tested that theory. He put the cotton, Gossipum hirsutum, and he simulated the salination and temperature of the Atlantic. After 2 weeks, the cotton sank. It would have taken 5 months unaided by man to come across. After 2 weeks, it sank. Didn't give it up. He said, perhaps it may sink, but it will remain submerged, clinging to driftwood, and come to America. And then in the 3rd week, it not only sank, it lost its potency. Experiment abandoned. That was not the end of the affair. V.W. Proctor, another botanist, said, birds flew from Africa with the cotton to America. Birds, you know, not blacks. And I want you to understand why they could not consider blacks. Because all the anthropological studies of blacks have been dealing with primitives or semi-primitives or little rural villages or simple people on the edge of the African cultural centers. Everybody does not operate at the same technological level. I know that from Europe. I spent 10.5 years in Europe. You think Europe is one place? It is very different. Like Africa. It is more advanced today than Africa is because we know why. We don't have to ask such silly questions. You can't take millions of people out of a continent, exploit it, take out of all its raw material for hundreds of years, misinform people, reduce them to a state of semi-starvation in many places, take the best minds out of the country, rip millions of people out of the heart and belly of the country, and then said, I wonder what happened to Africa. But in spite of that devastation, we have been able to go back and find things. Within the last 10 to 20 years, so much has been found in Africa that we suddenly begin to pause and realize we have to take off the blindfolds of this civilization. Not only was Star Ceti discovered, in 1978 rather, 2 American scientists, Peter Schmidt and Donald Avery of Brown University in Rhode Island, discovered Africans were smelting steel 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. Now that in itself is only surprising because it's Africa. Other people were smelting steel too. Not many. But what was shocking was to find the Africans were not merely smelting steel. They were smelting the finest bloom of carbon steel at temperatures of 1,850 degrees centigrade, which is 200 degrees higher than anything achieved in Europe until the 19th century. They were doing this in the 5th, using the most modest date, the 5th century AD. In other words, 1,000 years before Europe reached 1850, they had reached 1850. Secondly, they discovered the Africans were smelting steel in a single stage process. Even when George Wilhelm Siemens, the German, in the middle of the 20th century, discovered a process for mass producing steel, it was done in 2 crude processes. First, the sintering of solid particles, and then stage 2, in order to bring it to the fine bloom of carbon steel. The Africans jumped that stage because they had learned to produce iron crystals, which involves a semiconductor technology unknown until the 20th century. And then on top of that, they discovered again, to their astonishment, that the Africans were doing this using less fuel. They had been driven into fuel-saving technology because they did not have as much wood at their disposal. How could that be when Africa has such vast jungles? United Nations report, Africa has less jungle than any other continent comparable with its land space. By that is meant, if you took 2 Europes, and you could put 2 Europes in Africa, if you left out Soviet Asia, not Soviet Europe, but Soviet Asia, you could put 2 Europes in Africa. There's more woodland and forest in that comparable land space of 2 Europes than in Africa. My jungle, I come from Guyana, which is no jungle in itself. It has very sophisticated cities on the coast, but 85% of it is jungle. My country is larger than Britain, Scotland, and Wales put together. You could take a big city like London and bury it in my jungle and you wouldn't see it from the air. Okay, it's larger than any single jungle in Africa. But we get this impression about these great jungles. Ethiopia and Egypt and Carthage in the Hannibal period, and Mali and Songhai and Monomotapa and Ghana, those were not jungle empires. In one of those empires in Mali, which they call the Bright Country, vast savanna country, as large as all the states of Western Europe put together, according to what the Arabs said who had traveled through it. There was not a single slice of jungle. The Africans there were so afraid of the jungle that when they traded with the jungle Africans, they would take their goods and put it on the edge of the jungle, and the Africans would come out and give them something its equivalent. And then they would come and pick it up and go away with it. Not jungle empires. Let's get this very straight. So we have this fascination, these anthropologists had this fascination. There was I in the university, and I didn't get to university easy. Here in America, everybody gets their BA at 22, except a few slackers. I got it at 32. And I wasn't slacking. There was no university in my country. I couldn't go to university. At age 16, I had finished all my exams. There was nothing else to do. I sat it again at 17, and I sat it again at 18. At 16, I got 75. At 17, I got 80. At 18, I got 82. What do you think I was doing? I was trying to get as close to 100 as I can, because only those people in the 90s can get scholarships to go to university. 1 scholarship a year to go to university. So if you don't come first for the whole country, you don't go to university. And I see people here, young people, 28, 30, just kids. That's no age. People live until they're 70 and 90 in parts of my country, like in the jungles. You live until you're 30 and you die. And people come here and they're little, very young people and talk about they lost their chance. They can't educate themselves anymore. Pythagoras spent 22 years among the Egyptians before he finished his education. And I went out into that world, and I was so proud. After I was 28, I got into the university. I got a scholarship to go to a British university. And it was the best university in the world for studying African studies, so I was told. And I was very naive and thought, but how marvelous. And they were my teachers, world professors. They were world-renowned professors, and after 2 years, you began to realize it was easy to become a world-renowned professor, because all you had to do was to pick out something that nobody else picked out. And the only way to do that is to find an irrelevant, insignificant tribe. We all pick tribes, okay? If a tribe is vanishing and it is very far and it is in the deeps of the jungle or the desert and nobody wants to go there for a year, you pick it out. You'll be the world famous professor, because you would be an expert on the wooga booga. Because nobody gives a damn about wooga boogas. And we have thousands of studies like that, and these people try to extrapolate from these little simplicities what is essentially and quintessentially African. And you cannot do that. I could not do that with my little village. My village is irrelevant. to my development. It was critical in a sense because I do not despise my people. But you could not study my village and get a sense of what my country was about. It was like two worlds. You could not study my village and get a sense of what the South American continent was about. No, sir. You wouldn't have a foggiest idea. Why, therefore, do people think you could go anywhere in Africa, pick on any little tribe, and come back and say, this is the African? That's why we found nothing of significance among Africans. That's why the myth of their inferiority prevailed. And then we started to find a whole lot of things, not only their steel smelting machines. The same year we found they had astronomical observatories 300 years before Jesus. It was found in Kenya at Namorotungo, where the Africans were plotting a whole series of stars and constellations. They'd built an observatory with several alignment points, and on the basis of those alignments, they'd built one of the most accurate of prehistoric calendars. And then fine anthropologists like Marcel Griol and German Dieterlin went in West Africa and found the Dogon, an unusual people. Ogotomeli, one of their elders, sat down for 21 days non-stop, only stopping to sleep and eat, and spoke out several books. And then you find the African highly sophisticated. He is plotting star systems. The Dogon spoke of an invisible star, a white dwarf, which we had never seen in modern astronomy. They not only saw it, they plotted its orbit right up to the end of the 20th century, up to the year 1990. It's dead correct. They showed that although it seemed to be a tiny star, it was the heaviest type of star in our galaxy. Our machine showed that is dead correct. They said it had an elliptical orbit of 50 years around its parent star, Sirius A, and an orbit on its own axis. Our machine showed it had a 50-year orbit. We haven't caught up with the one-year orbit yet. They pointed to an object flashing and darkening, contracting and expanding within the region of Sirius B. The Einstein orbiting satellite found that 3.5 years ago. Do you know when the Africans found that? 5 centuries ago. And we didn't just find that. Claudia Zaslavsky, who spent half of her adult life in Africa, wrote the first book on African mathematical systems. How come when I was studying anthropology, I was told there were no mathematical systems in Africa? Because where they were studying in the bush and the desert, people counted with their fingers. Mathematical systems were among developed Africans, which were never studied because the African is not developed. Okay, so that you don't look where you should be looking. So they never found anything. She found mathematical systems where there were complex peoples. People who needed mathematics because they were involved in intensive and extensive trading. And then scripts. I was told the Africans never wrote. That's what I was told in university. We are preliterate, they said. But don't worry, we are giving you scripts. I did not know that the English who were telling me the Africans were preliterate are preliterate also. The English have no script. A lot of people haven't brooded on that. There is no English script. The script you use to use Anglo-Saxon songs is Roman. The English never wrote. When the Romans attacked Britain, they found nobody reading or writing. The Romans gave them a script. The English have no script. The French have no script. The Germans have no script. The Dutch have no script. The Romans brought a script and gave it to them. Europe has about half a dozen scripts. Roman script, Greek script, Russian script, the Phoenician script, which is half and half, Celtic script, which is also half and half according to the Book of Balamoth, 1 or 2 more. Africa has as many pre-European scripts. Africa has the Mande script, We have found about 200 characters in the Mande script, starting from Udmurtutek, 3000 BC, running across the Sahara. You can find remnants of it in the Vai script. We have the Akan script, both a drum script and a written script. We have the Faka script, the only script that African Americans brought to America. It's found in Suriname. They made the big mistake there because they brought too many of them belonging to the same tribe. They revolted and defeated the Europeans. The Europeans sued for peace, and the Africans said, if you want peace, give us guns. Which the Europeans did, and they retained their independence. And there are other scripts, the Meroitic script, which we are trying to decode and decipher, which we have not succeeded in doing, and the hieroglyphic script, which we thought had originated in Egypt, but which we know now originated at Kustal on the edge of the Sudan, at least 200 years before the first Egyptian dynasty. But where are the books, they say? The earliest books in the world are African. The Book of the Dead, or rather it should be called the Book of the Coming Forth by Night and Day. The pyramid texts, the Papyrus of Ani. You will hear tomorrow from Dr. Ben the profound impact of those books upon the thinking of the Greeks. Look at the medical literature of the world. They said the clinical method began with the Greeks. It did not. You can read the Edwin Smith Papyrus, Dr. Finch, whom you will hear tomorrow. Dr. Finch has done a commentary recently for the journal on the Edwin Smith Papyrus, showing it as only 1/3 of an earlier manuscript written down in the 18th dynasty by a surgeon in Egypt, and that it only deals with the head and neck and the brain. Yet there are 200 terms. There are 200 medical terms for things inside and outside the head. He said that they discovered in that very early time things which we only know today through X-rays. He said that they found the locus in the brain through which auditory information is processed. They were working on pulse taking 1,000 years before Herophilus, the Greek who was credited with pulse taking. And then the Greeks came. And the Greeks, I must say, though some people may disagree with me, relative to what was to happen later, showed a profound respect and reverence for the Africans whom they defeated. Alexander built his city in Africa. And the Greeks went to Africa to be educated, even as I, out of my shattered world, had to go to Europe to be educated. They went. Thales of Miletus, Democritus, Pythagoras, Eudoxius, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, all of them went. St. Clement of Alexandria said if you were to write a book of 1,000 pages, you could not put down the names of all the Greeks who went to Egypt. And even those who did not go claimed they went because it was prestigious. And everything that was of significance and consequence they brought back. And as I have pointed out, that does not demote the Greeks. They're not the first in this and the first in that, but they did remarkable things. But their debt to Egypt was profound. And they admitted that. They admitted it. Even the gods. They took Zeus and all sorts of gods and goddesses out of Egypt. The goddess of chastity is Artemis, a black woman. Circe in the Odyssey is a black woman with African features, not just ritually black. Andromeda is represented as a woman with black skin in some of the early Grecian vases. Andromeda, who married Perseus, the Greek hero. And Medea, who helped Jason win the golden fleece, is represented as a black woman. And Isis, the mother of God, the sister of God, the wife of God, the female principle of the divine. She is not just worshipped among Africans, she becomes the major figure among the Europeans. Even Caligula, the Roman lunatic, worshipped Isis. It is found even in the British Isles. And Isis and Horus were first seen as Mary and Jesus, until Michelangelo comes in the scene and starts painting his family as Jesus. And all of these things, they took medical literature out. The medical school, of course, in Greece followed all the things of the Egyptians. Even Isaac Newton, the most remarkable scientist before Einstein, said several things were prefigured in Egypt. They had a concept of the atom, he said, even though they called it the monad, and even though they had certain mystical notions about it, they saw it as the building block of the physical universe. The conceptions by the early Africans, the Dogon, the Bambara, the Egyptian, were of a world which had primal matter, like a primeval soup, just as we modern physicists today believe, and a latent consciousness which grew to flowering, producing some extraordinary spirit which we call God, who then reconstituted the elements and divided them and set the universe into a certain direction, establishing certain principles. Something so advanced, so complex, so subtle. These are not simple people. And it must have taken hundreds and hundreds of years for them to arrive at that kind of highly complex knowledge. So even though it was as to use a phrase from one of the manuscripts of Benga translated, even though it was the morning of times, it was something far in advance of what many of us think and feel today. Something extraordinary had come upon the world, and it was to leave its mark on so many people. When the Egyptians struck 110 cities in Asia, they brought these things too into Asia. They brought these things through their invasion of the Greeks. Things were brought up into Europe. Look at our day. We take our day for granted. The 24-hour day is African. The second of time is African. The second of arc is African. Many of our volumes and weights and measures. And you look at the year, 365 and a quarter day year. That was not for granted. There's no street. To get that, you'd have to have accurate mathematics. The Sumerians or Babylonians or Mesopotamians, as they call them, did not have a 365 and a quarter day year. Yet they say how they influenced the Egyptian. They even tried to bring Egyptian chronology down into a certain date to fit with Sumerian chronology, even though it was shown very clearly by Kugler and others that the latest carbon date, the earliest carbon date for Sumerian civilization is hundreds of years after the Egyptian. They're not interested in the precision. No, it has to fit. Because since the Africans could not have created a place in Africa, we have to find some other people who must have made this thing possible. And so, how could you compare Sumer with Egypt? Ur, Lagash, and those places, those were city-states. They did not have the centralized network, the empire that the Egyptians created. And look at their writing system, the cuneiform tablets, the merchant bills and notes. They did not have the great literature of the Egyptians. Where is their literature compared to the literature of the Egyptians? The thousands of things that we have found even today in spite of the devastation. And look at their architecture. Who could compare the architecture of the Egyptians with the Sumerians? We cannot even reconstruct the Mesopotamian temple when the Egyptian works stand immortal upon the face of the earth. When the Sphinx, when the Great Pyramid was finished and it had its polished limestone casing, they say it was like a star over the earth. You could stand for hundreds of miles and see it shining. What is there in Sumer and in Babylon like that? They say the stone that was involved in the building of the Great Pyramid could build 30 Empire State Buildings. If you were to cut it into 1-foot cubes, it would encircle 2/3 of the belly of this planet. What are they talking about? And you look at all these things, you look at the medical documents you find in those Edwin Smith papyri, helminthiasis, ophthalmology, gynecology, pregnancy diagnosis, many things, studies of the pulse, studies in diagnostic percussion, fractures of the clavicle, dislocation in the mandible. Word for word, Hippocrates takes out the fractures of the clavicle and dislocation in the mandible and puts it in his work. And he's the father of medicine, appearing long after Imhotep. He never called himself, give it the due to the Greeks. They did not make those claims. It's later people made those claims. Later people who said that they were the first, and they never said so. They never said so. The Greeks showed respect. Imhotep, the great black multi-genius, was worshipped as a god among the Europeans, just as among the Africans. But so much had passed, and there was these assumptions. And it was, as Bernal points out in Black Athena, it was not until the early 19th century that there was a determined, sustained attempt, beginning with the Germans, to set this thing up on its head. The Negro does not belong to the civilized world. The Negro has a small brain. That went on for a while until they started examining brains, and they found that the South African bushman had a larger brain, so they dropped that one. Well, it isn't the size of the brain, it's the convolutions in the brain. And then they would take prisoners or people suffering from some disease in the hospitals and examine their brains and compare them with European brains. As Diop said, when I die, you should compare the convolutions in my brain. And now we have come to a point where you have all of this liberal story. Ah, yes, okay, forget that. That was a mistake. We were very prejudiced. We were racist. We admit it, so forth. Okay, fine, you're equal. And then when you try to prove through history you're equal, why are you making such a fuss? Haven't we given you enough? Why are you trying to claim our thing? See, it's very important to understand that. And Pythagoras brought the Pythagorean theorem out of Egypt. We have found earlier evidence of that. And as Newton said, Isaac Newton said that apart from their concept of the atom, they had a heliocentric theory of the solar system. They believed the sun was the center and the other bodies revolved around that. That was not known then in Europe. It was not accepted in Europe. And they also believed, they also had theories about gravity. He said it was clear in the harmony of the spheres which the Pythagoreans brought up from Egypt that they saw the relationship between bodies in terms of gravitation and attraction, etc. All of these things were prefigured in early Egypt. But because it was so important in the world, because its impact was so great, and because it had affected European civilization, it had to be pushed aside. But now, we will not allow that anymore. We just have to be very careful, and this is something that happens in all movements, not to claim that everything is black. That is not necessary. The contributions of the black to the world are so great in terms of what we know now that it is not necessary to claim things that are not necessarily true. In the field of medicine, for example, they have found incredible things. They have found vaccines among Africans long before Edwin Jenner. They found the smallpox vaccine had been brought to this country by Onesimus, a slave of Cotton Mather. They found that the Africans were using aspirin long before the Western nations, that the Bantu were using Salix capensis, which yields salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin. They found the Africans had made breakthroughs in eye cataract surgery in the 13th century. Africans were performing eye cataract surgery in the Empire of Mali, in the city of Djenné. Nobody in the world was performing eye cataract surgery at the time. And there were certain surgeries in Africa which taught surgeries which had a profound effect on surgery in Europe. In the 1870s, whenever the cesarean operation was performed, the cesarean section was performed in women, the woman invariably died in Europe. Because of the British Empire, the British learned that Africans were performing the cesarean successfully. A team under Dr. Felkin went out to East Africa among the Banyoro surgeons to study how they were performing this operation. They noted, please note, that the Africans had developed their own anesthetics and their own antiseptics. Antiseptics had only been introduced in an European operating theater by Lister 2 years earlier than the witness of this operation. Many doctors in Europe did not know, as late as the 1870s, that even if you perform a successful operation, your hands, the poison in your fingertips will kill the patient. They did not have proper antiseptics. They washed their hands in water. They found the Africans were using sterile antiseptics. They saw how they cut. They saw how they collapsed the abdominal wall. They saw how they took the baby out. They saw how they were able to take the cautery iron and stop internal bleeding almost instantly with minor tissue damage. They saw how the Africans stitched. They drew the stitches. They brought it back to Europe. And the cesarean operation after that was performed with far greater success. Nobody knows, unless you study the history of medicine, that that was what happened. Now let me close, because I can go on forever. I'm so warmed by the great crowd tonight. But we have to close. There are other things. First of all, we have the slides which will go beyond the question of Egypt. But let me close by paying tribute now to Sheikh Anta Diop. I want, in closing, to quote a poem. I want, in closing, to quote a poem which was written by Martin Carter, my countryman, on the death of my father. It is called Death of a Comrade. And it is very apt, I feel, with the grief that one felt in the passing of a great brother and friend and colleague, as well as the great hope that springs out of knowing that nothing really dies. Too soon, the banner draped for you. I would prefer a banner in the wind, not bound so tightly with a scarlet fold, not sodden with your people's tears, but borne aloft, down and beyond this dark, dark lane of rags. Dear comrade, if it must be that I no longer speak with you, no longer walk with you, no longer march with you, then I must take a patience and a calm. For even now, a greener leaf explodes, sun brightens stones, and all the rivers burn. Now from the morning vanguard moving on, dear comrade, I salute you and I say, death shall not find us thinking that we die. Thank you.
We want to provide an opportunity for you to ask questions. I know that you really have enjoyed what Dr. Van Sertima has had to say here tonight. Can we give him again another round of applause? You'll have to come to the edge of the stage in order to ask your questions. We don't have microphones out in the aisles.
Microphone.
First of all, thank you.
Speak loudly.
First of all, it's very great honor to be before you. But I had a question concerning pre-African civilization. Right now, I'm reading a classic by Gabriel concerning Atlantis, and I was wondering what was your comments on that civilization.
The question is about Atlantis. What is my comment on that civilization? I do not know that there is such a civilization. It is possible that in the coming future one may discover hard evidence of the existence of Atlantis, but I do not know that Atlantis exists. Okay, that's the answer to the question. Okay, this is a question about the book edited by me, Nile Valley Civilizations. This will come out in late July. This is a question about Jesus. The speaker, the questioner, does not think that Jesus was an actual person, and seeking my opinion on this. Now, there are very strong views about this. I personally believe that Jesus was a living individual. The fact that many of the myths that were planted on the skeletal history of the individual life, many of the things that came from the past, many of the things that came out of Egypt were planted on Jesus after his death, does not mean that he did not exist as an individual. My feeling that he did exist as an individual is because his sayings, not the mere philosophy as such, because there's nothing new under the sun, the way in which he spoke of certain things, and the peculiar acts, some of which have no precedence whatsoever in the earlier world, in that particular way in which it occurred, convinces me that we are dealing with an individual reality. Whether he came back from the dead, that is another matter. That is a matter of faith. But if the question is whether I believe that he existed as an individual, I say yes. And in fact, we do have a coin struck in the 2nd century AD by the Romans in the reign of Justinian II, in which we have the European emperor, the Roman Emperor Justinian II on one side, clearly European, and on the other side we have a dark brown man with woolly hair and a Semitic nose, which is represented the first physical representation of Jesus, a mixture perhaps of the Semitic type and the African, and what you would call an Afro-Semite. Whether that actually represents the actual Jesus, we do not know. We only present it because it's the first physical representation attempted of Jesus, the Christ.
How do we structure our educational system so that our young people can receive the truth in mass, as you have expressed it here today?
The question is, how can we structure our educational system so that our young people can receive these truths in mass? Now, this has to become a crusade that involves all of us. Please remember that that a person can only do so much and no more. It literally takes me all of my energy to speak in 20 to 25 states, to edit a journal, to teach at my university, etc., I cannot take charge of the educational system of the United States. Okay, we have to remember not to rely on a few people to do something like this. Most of us who are involved in this field, even though we are no longer alone and we are in a school, we have no power to change the system. But we have a power in this sense that by building a responsible body of work, a responsible body of new history, this will eventually impact on a great number of people. In each state, you have to have educational boards, or you have to have teachers who take it upon themselves, after we as educators have created the literature, take it upon themselves to introduce that to their children and to their schools. There are 9 titled journals. Half of them are now in print. All of them will be in print at the end of this year. People have complained they came before Columbus is very expensive. It now sells for $19.95. They can't afford it. But I'm now doing the paperback edition, so everybody will be able to afford it. There are the books of other very fine people here. There's the works of Dr. Ben. There are fine things done by Runoko Rashidi. There are a whole lot of people here who've done very remarkable things. Dr. Finch, who will hear tomorrow, and quite a number of other people. I'm only mentioning 1 or 2 because I can't think of all the names of the people at this conference. But I want you to become aware that these things are being created. But none of these gentlemen could just jump up in the air and throw his books across the states, and their pages will all come fluttering down. We have to realize we have a serious responsibility. It's a common responsibility. This is a crusade. Okay, go ahead.
Next question.
Yes, I heard yesterday they opened a tomb somewhere in Rome, Italy, and I was wondering if the Egyptians teach the Romans the pyramid that they opened yesterday in Rome.
I don't know anything about it. This is a query about some pyramid that was unveiled in Rome yesterday, but I know nothing about it.
Next question.
Yes. Oh yes. I just want you to be aware of one of the 2 people I just mentioned, Runoko Rashidi, who is co-editor with me. In fact, he's the true editor. This is a field that I know very little about. African presence in early Asia. Please give a hand to Runoko Rashidi. Would you stand up? In fact, he will give you the definitive talk on Ramesses II tomorrow. Okay.
Why did the Egyptians paint themselves green? And why did they separate themselves from?
Very interesting question. Why did the Egyptians paint themselves red, and why did they separate themselves from other people? Now, red ochre, and this is what I find so strange, because all anthropologists should know that red ochre was used for thousands of years by Africans as a ritual thing that they put on their skin. It was a symbol of vitality. It had nothing to do with skin color. They dusted this red ochre. Therefore, you find paintings of Africans at times with very clearly African features, but with reddish skin. That is not necessarily the skin of the person. You find the use of yellow in the same way for women. The Egyptians, like most nations, reach a point where they make a certain national identification and separate themselves. The French separate themselves from the Germans separate themselves from the English separate themselves from the Russian. They don't just say we're all white people. Okay, so the fact that they separate themselves as a nation doesn't doesn't become a ground for people excusing, a ground for people saying that shows that they were not real Negroes or black people. Okay, well, I want to make that quite clear. We don't do that by saying it's very clear since the French separate themselves as a nation that they're not Europeans.
Yes, could you briefly comment on what you think some of the implications of the lack of the kind of knowledge that you have brought forth and Diop brought forth, what some of those, the implications of those are today for Africans in the worldwide diaspora, but particularly in here in the belly of the beast?
Yeah. What are the implications? And I think that was very clear. What are the implications of all this? First of all, let me speak from my own experience. I have suffered tremendously in my early life because I grew up with a terrible inferiority complex. I felt that I was inferior. I really believed that because every evidence that was presented to me, all the books I read, all the things I saw in the world, made it absolutely clear to me that I belonged in an inferior race. There was not a single book on Africa in my library except Tarzan. There was not a single film I ever saw in Africa where the African wasn't some kind of semi-savage. There was not a single thing ever said about the African except that he was physically strong. How could I possibly therefore believe that he had civilization when I never saw any book showing that civilization? Now comes the question, what kind of thing did that do to me? It could have killed me. At the age of 32, I decided to take my life. I could easily have been snuffed out. The knowledge that came with the realization that shattered though our people were scattered and dispersed across the diaspora, that we could recover enough that could give us a sense of wholeness so that our psyche could be healed, so that we no longer had to feel this self-hatred and self-contempt, so that we no longer wanted to do as one of our novelists from Guyana did. He, growing up like me, in spite of his achievements, so desperately wanted to rid himself of himself that he took gasoline and lit a match and burned his skin off. Naturally, he died. This is the kind of horror we lived with. We did not want to be black because black was associated with everything that was inferior. So do not for one moment think, as some people here think, that we in the Caribbean or out in Africa suffer any less anguish in terms of racism. We desperately needed to know so that we could feel again like real human beings. And the energy that was generated by those discoveries was so extraordinary that it's as if our circuits were charged all over again, as if we actually started to live again. It's as if we had come out of the grave after the crucifixion of racism, that we had come out of the grave and started to walk in the world again. So, if you want to know what are the implications, those are the implications, that we are made whole by this reconstruction, that those shattered pieces are pulled together again so that we can be healed by this. And those people who have oppressed us and still in various ways do still oppress us may have a different conception of the world, a different vision of themselves in history, a different vision of us in history, so they too may not have the blinders, may not have the same kind of contempt, the same kind of hatred of us, so that by their being liberated as we are liberated, they may liberate us. Now I would like to show you some slides very quickly. It is very important that you should see some of these things. So if you would cut the lights, we can begin. This is a figure, a sculpture that was found in early Europe. And one of the things that they have discovered is that many of the sculptures of early Europe show various African types. In fact, 55,000 years ago, according to 3 labs, the University of Oxford, the University of Hawaii, the University of California at Berkeley have come to the conclusion that there are no people on the earth 55,000 years ago who are not black Africans. Then you have a number of Africans who are caught in the ice. Some people put it around southwestern Russia, some put it around Spain, but they're caught in the ice. And this type, which Diop and others call the Grimaldi type, undergoes a mutation over the next 10,000 years. The dropping of pigmentation, because in the ice, in the twilight of Europe at that time, where there's not enough sun that can come through the pigmentation shield, which is necessary to deal with ultraviolet radiation, you have a dropping of pigmentation, and you have a pink Africoid, not yet a Caucasoid. A pink Africoid, morphologically African, but with pink skin, the albino type. This albanization, which would have been fatal in Africa and in certain tropical countries, becomes a stabilized type in Europe, a selected type, and so you have the pink type emerging, eventually undergoing facial morphological change, the narrower nose, thinner lips, etc., contracted features, longer hair, which is necessary to protect the neck from cold, as against the hair that is shorter in order to allow heat loss in the tropics. So then you have mutations, not evolution, but mutation. And then you find going into Asia, the Africoid type, as Renoka Rashidi has shown, there are 100 million blacks still in Asia. That mutation occurred the beginning, for example, of the epicantic fold to deal with the wind across the Asian steppes. Then we have anomalies like the Eskimo, which remains black in the ice because he does not have to drop pigmentation to survive, because he's near, he gets his vitamin D from the seals and from fish oils, which the black caught in the ice of southwestern Russia and in parts of Spain, etc., could not accommodate himself to this new situation without the loss of pigmentation. What they have found within the last few years, within the last 5 years, in fact, it is reported in Nature that the founding population of the modern world is African. It is not just that the first man is African. That was known for a long time, and that doesn't mean anything, because man went through various sequences in evolution. They found that all the 6 sequences are African, and that the final man, which makes modern man with the brain of modern man, is African. And therefore they've come to the conclusion that all humans on the earth are anatomically African. Let me make this quite clear, because this is one of the things that we have to be extremely careful about. That does not make the African superior, because the differences are extremely superficial. What has happened in these hemispheres, particularly the American hemisphere, and across the world, is such a devastating thing that it becomes emotionally warming to feel that one is superior to somebody else belonging to different racial group, etc. That has no validity in biology. We are people. And what we are involved in here is not trying to establish new superiorities and inferiorities. We are trying to put an end to these illusions about superiority and inferiority. Okay, next slide, sorry. I'm supposed to be. Some black types survived in spite of the ice. This is early Britain. This is early Britain too. See the texture of hair, etc., the full lips. This is a black knight. This is in Anglo-Saxon Britain. This is early Britain. This is in Crete, which had a profound influence on early Greek civilization, not just the Egyptian. This is a scene of black warriors in Crete, Minoan Crete, which was to have a profound influence on the great European civilization, Greek. Here are black. This is 3,000 years before Jesus. This is scenes of a navigational expedition. This is a stag hunt in Crete. This is captain of the guards in Crete. This is a priest in Crete. This is one of the things found at Tarseti. They found thousands of stoneware vessels, pottery, jewelry, ancient cloth, etc. This is showing some of the palace serex and facades. King sitting on his throne with the crown of the south, the falcon god, Horus, etc. This is God among the Egyptians. Once again, you see the African features, but the use of red ochre, the ritual color that is used, that has been used for thousands of years. This is Isis, the sister wife of God, the feminine principle. The Egyptians did not believe God was a he. God is a he, she. Okay. A combination of the polar opposites. And there is little Horus, the sun. This is supposed to be Narmer Menes, the first Egyptian pharaoh. You will see lots of pictures during the talks that follow me, where you will see a far greater range of Egyptian types. This is Zoser, the builder of the step pyramid. When I say the builder, I mean he was the king who supervised the building. It is in his reign that Imhotep built the step. This is Imhotep, the multi-genius of this. As you can see quite clearly, he's the brown Mediterranean type. Okay. The tan Caucasoid. Okay. He was the man who built the first pyramid out of hewn stone. He was also a prime minister. He was also a mathematician. He was also a doctor. He was a very extraordinary man. And he was worshipped as Imhotep among the Greeks and Imhotep among the Africans. This is Mentuhotep, the first. And then what is unusual about this is the red crown of the north and the white crown of the south, the joining of the two lands. This is Sesostris, who took armies into many lands. The Russians found about 50 years ago a village in the Caucasus, right in Russia, in the heart of Russia, where all the people were black. They did not know where they came from. We do believe, however, that it could have had to do with one of Sesostris' armies, because he went right up into the Black Sea. We've even found blacks in Odessa. This is Akhenaten. They said the reason why he had a face like this is because he was sick. He is the man who brought about the religious reformation, and he insisted that they should only have one representation of the God. This is greatly misunderstood among a lot of people, because the Africans did conceive of a supreme being. In that sense, therefore, they were monotheists. However, they believed in the representation of various qualities and attributes of that God. This is something that also comes out in the later Christianity of Europeans, when the Europeans were eventually converted to Christianity about 2 centuries after the death of Jesus. They also introduced the various saints, etc., and people could call these semi-deities. They're not semi. They are extensions and attributes, as the Egyptians call them, netters. Anyway, he insisted on this single God concept of just having one idea of the God, which led to fights between Aton and Amon, the priest of Amon. Eventually, he either disappeared or was murdered or went away. We do not know what happened to him, but he's very famous as the great religious reformer. This is King Ai, who became prime minister during the reign of Tut Tutankhamun. This is Tut here. And this is the mother of both Tut and Akhenaten, the Nubian queen who married her pharaoh. She, at 13, married her pharaoh who was 53, 51 or 53, Amenhotep III. She became the most powerful woman on earth for 50 years. When her pharaoh began to wither with age, she filled the void. Kings of Asia bypassed him to talk with her about the affairs of state. When Akhenaten, because of his commitment to the religious reformation, neglected the defense of Egypt, she made sure that Egypt was defended. When Tut was too young to rule, she became queen regent. Everything she did was watched closely. Her earrings, her wigs, her eye shadow, etc., her dresses were all emulated by the ladies of both lands. She was so deeply loved by her pharaoh that he built a lake for her 1 mile long. We can still see that lake, the lake of Tai. This Queen Tai, quietly behind the scenes, wielded power for about 50 years over the greatest empire in the world. This is one of her daughters. And this is Taharqa, coming to the evening dynasty. When I was studying Taharqa from the book They Came Before Columbus, all the books I picked up said that he was Caucasoid or Afro-Asiatic or Euro. There was no African in him. In fact, Shinny, who at the UNESCO conference said that race is subjective, he insisted that this one did not have anything black in him. And Arkell said that it is improbable that Taharqa could have been a Negro, though he may have had 1 drop of Negro blood in his veins. This is the drop. He was a very remarkable man. At a very young age, he became Field Marshal of the Nubian and Egyptian forces. He entered Jerusalem to protect the Jews from the attack of the Syrians. In spite of the fact that the Jewish sect or the Judaic sect was persecuted by the Egyptians. Now, not persecuted because of race, because the Jews are not a race. There were both black Jews at the time, the dominant type, as well as Semitic Jews coming from other places, and much, much, much later, the white Jews. And there is no harm in that. That is no criticism. If you have a sect, a religion, everybody should be able to join it. There are white Buddhists, there are black Buddhists, there are Asiatic Buddhists, there are white Muslims, there are black Muslims, there are Asiatic Muslims, there are white Christians, black Christians, Asiatic Christians. Why shouldn't there be black, white, and Semitic Jews? He went in the defense of the Jews in 701 BC. It's recorded in the Bible and in other documents. And the Bible said a plague struck the Assyrians, but it wasn't a plague, it was malaria, which the blacks brought up, which they had a protection, which they brought up into the battlefield, not on purpose, but it did have some effect on the Asiatics. This was the last of the great sun kings of the ancient world. Now I want you to look at this face. This is Masai. This is an African woman. If she was represented in Egyptian sculpture, they would swear that she was a Caucasoid. She's very black. That skin is a very dark brown. The photograph is taken with a flash. The structure of the face, everything that belongs to clearly African tribe. The assumption that all Africans look alike is something that had to do with an attempt to box them into a certain construct. Okay, so that when they appeared to fall out of that construct, then they had to be Caucasoids. This is one of the great princesses of ancient Egypt. Would you believe that this is a mummy? Her hair is well preserved, her teeth, her skin. This is about 4,000 years old. No people on earth, it's not just the pyramids, no people on earth ever managed to preserve flesh like this. It is just as if she died yesterday. In fact, I have seen people in their coffins looking no different than this. Close up. These are some of the wigs we were photographing in the Cairo Museum when we were stopped. Some of them are classified as lions here. I will come to that in a moment. These are wigs worn by kings and queens and priests and priestesses in ancient Egypt. Look very closely at that texture. This is classified as the lions here, as I said the other day. It is possible that the lioness probably braided the hair of the lion. This shows you the earliest settlements, agricultural settlements in the world at Wadi Kubani in Egypt and Wadi Tushka on the edge of the Sudan, where they found agricultural settlements earlier than any other civilization. Wendorf and Schill said it was 7,000 years earlier than Asiatic or European, but that was a mistake. It's not as early as that. It has been downdated, but it's still earlier than other civilizations. Here is a page from the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which has the most modern medical diagnoses and treatments. Here is one of the things surviving from early African mathematics. Africans were the first to introduce ciphers. In fact, in Europe, Europeans did not have ciphers. They had letters for numbers. The Greeks had letters for numbers. The Romans had letters for numbers. In Roman, 1 is 1, 2 is 1, 1, 3 is 1, 1, 1, 4 is 1, V. Then you start all over again. 5 is V, 6 is V1, then V1, 1, then V1, 1, 1. And so it went on. How difficult to conduct mathematics like that. The ciphers were brought by the Moors into the commercial circles. When Fibonacci found the number system in India, that was not accepted by the Europeans. Then the Moors invaded India and brought the number system 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 out of India. Some people have advanced evidence. This is circumcision. This is thousands of years old. This was the circumcision operation. This is cutting holes, circular holes in the skull. This is medical instruments in ancient times. This is showing you the pyramid, the kinds of calculations, the measurements, which were so important, indicate to you their knowledge of the cosmos, their knowledge of the measurements of the earth, etc. This shows you how their mathematics, their metaphysics and their science are blended. All these ideas about the double hall of truth, etc., and the various passages. This is one of the things indicating to you, though we do not yet know fully how they did it, how they moved heavy objects, we discovered they had a mixture which they could put upon the earth, and that it would create something that is as smooth as ice so that they could push a heavy object over it. This is a scaling ladder used in the building of pyramids. We have found pictures drawn. Once again, you see the red and yellow color, although the features are not that of red and yellow people. We found things, light in the underground of the pyramids. We found pictures, illuminated pictures, and they wondered how could that happen? How did the Egyptians light the underground when they had no electric, they had no lamps, they had no candles, no torches? And they found metallic mirrors that were so placed in the pyramids that they could ricochet the light from a star or the sun, and that they would so arrange the ventilator shaft that it could be aligned to that star or the sun, enabling the light to be ricocheted through the chambers. This is an invention around 300 BC, the first pneumatic organ in the world, the first steam engine in the world, although it did not go into general production. This is Isis and Horus, which was to become the prototype of the Black Madonna and Child in Europe. Here it is again, Isis. Here is the Black Diana. Here is in Europe now, in wood carving, Isis and the little boy Horus, sometimes the features becoming European but retaining their ritual blackness from the early pictures. Here in Nuria, Spain, right in the heart of Spain, the Black Madonna and Child, Isis and Horus, Mary and Jesus. This is a black pope, Pope Miltiades, who became the Pope of Rome between 311 and 314 AD. This is a picture that is more than 1,000 years old. This is one of the 25 black saints in the Catholic Church. This is Saint Maurice, who became patron saint of Austrian Germany until he was removed in Hitler's time. Here he is again. Saint Benedict the Moor. Alexander Dumas. I must go now very quickly through these. Some of the half-white, half-black types who became very prominent in Europe. Here is from the black village in the Caucasus, discovered by the Russians. This is a black boy who was adopted by the Tsar of Russia, Peter the Great. He became a very powerful figure in Russia. He became a general in the Russian army. He was also a diplomat. He signed a treaty between Russia and Sweden. He was also an engineer. He became the tutor in math for the Crown Prince of Russia, and he also built a famous aqueduct in Russia. This is his grandson, Pushkin. He was a very famous poet, as most of you know, who transformed the Russian language. He's deeply respected in that category. He wrote poetry which eventually became revolutionary. He was warned by the Tsar, but he insisted, and eventually he had to be exiled. Then he was pardoned, but told not to write again. He came back. He became quite a womanizer. He married a woman who was barely a child. She fell in love with a Russian officer. He challenged the Russian officer to a duel, and he was punctured in his stomach, and he died. And the day he died, the Russians would not allow anyone to cut classes. They were afraid university students would cause a riot. Thousands of people filed past his bier. He's still deeply respected in Russia. There are several statues to him. He was very proud of his black ancestry. He boasted about it, as did Alexander Dumas. This is the Black Diana, Black Venus, sorry. There's a fascination with the black woman in Europe. The black woman was thought to be extraordinarily beautiful. And as a consequence of this, many of the European royalty had black women, the French in particular, as well as the Portuguese and the Italians. In fact, Louis XIV had a black mistress. This was a pope's son by a black woman, Pope Clement VIII, when he was Cardinal de' Medici, one of the powerful families of Italy, gave birth to a black son who became the Duke of Florence. And then there was the Louis of France, who all had black women, and Louis XIV, his wife, Queen Marie-Therese, was very annoyed with him for his fascination with a black woman. This is not the woman. Then she had an affair with a black man in the court and gave birth to this child. This caused quite a scandal in the court, and then King Louis XIV asked his doctors, "How could I give birth to a black child?" And his doctors said, "Do you see that man in your coat, that black man in your coat, Nabo? It is quite possible that when your wife was pregnant, he looked at her and the child turned black." And the king said, "It must have been a very penetrating look." And this is the product of that union. She became quite famous. She was known as the Nun of Moray. We get this from the studies of Edward Scobie, who's done some excellent work on blacks in early Europe, in the book African Presence in Early Europe. By the way, all of these pictures are available in the books that I have edited, the Journal of African Civilization. These are not strictly my books. I edit them. You become aware of the school of thinkers and writers that have emerged as a result of the Journal of African Civilization. Those of you who are worried about how this information comes through, that information exists in tapes, which by the way are on sale here. They exist in books which are on sale here. So do not go out of here wondering how this information is not floating about anymore. It is set down by our scholars. The Duke of Chartres, she was put in the monastery, isolated, but she was visited by the royal family. The Duke of Chartres fell in love with her and begged King Louis to give permission to marry her, and he refused, and she was returned to the monastery where she died. These are figures on the coin struck after Hannibal defeated the Romans at Cannae, and everybody argued that it couldn't be people of consequence. They were elephant riders because they were too negroid looking to be of consequence. Petard and Gazelle showed that when they went to the graves of Carthage at the time of Hannibal, the Africoid type was the dominant type, and that Hannibal was probably Africoid. And Wayne Chandler has shown a coin with an African on one side and Surus, the elephant of Hannibal, on the other. Now, I will come very quickly. These are the areas of learning. This is from the Moorish period, captain of the guards. These are the people who charged into Europe. This is from the Senegal. These are warriors behind the veil. This is a black ritual in the heart of Europe, the circumcision ritual during the time of the Moors. These are the Moors advancing into Spain. You have one of the dignitaries coming through the streets and the way is being cleared for them. This is drawn by their enemies, since the Muslims were not allowed to draw themselves. So we get pictures of them through their enemies, painting them. These are black noblemen sitting in 12th century Spain playing chess. This is the Prime Minister of Sicily during the Moorish period, Johannes Moras. This is a Moor from a later period. These are from books of their inventions. They introduced incredible things into Europe: worm and pinion gears operated hydraulically, crankshafts, windmills, thousands of public markets, public baths, public libraries, mills. They introduced strawberries, lemons, ginger into Europe. They introduced the cotton industry. They introduced silks. They introduced sugar. All of these things were introduced into Europe. They introduced optics, new concepts in trigonometry, algebra. These are areas out of which they come. This is a map, and now we're coming to close now. This is a map of Africa drawn by Leo Africanus. Leo Africanus, who showed that the Europeans were very wrong in their conception. This was 16th, 17th century of Africa as an empty place because there were so many interior cities. And he wrote the Geography and History of Africa. Shakespeare read the book, and he quoted lines from it in Othello. This is the man who led to Othello. This is a white Italian who married this woman, this black woman, giving birth to a son and a daughter. The daughter is up there. And this is the son. This is Othello, who married a European woman whom he murdered on Christmas Day. Cinzio wrote a novel about it, and Shakespeare picked up the novel and did Othello. This is Laurence Olivier blackening himself up as Othello, and this is Paul Robeson. And that's it for this evening. We're having a reception, and our tapes and books will be on display. Thank you very much.